Much. All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here. I am incredibly excited to have all of you, and today we'll be talking about my favorite topic of all time, which is how to hire folks, and especially how to hire extremely high caliber talent early into your company, FANG caliber talent that is really, really hard to find and come by. So without further ado, let's get started. My name is Nia, and as Alistair mentioned, I'm the founder of a company called Candor. And what we do at Candor is negotiate on behalf of candidates with companies, mainly with FANG and unicorn companies, but also with very early startups. When you're hiring your first product manager, your first engineer, your first even executive, very often those folks are talking to us or to someone like us to get help and assistance in making a career decision. And so by virtue of that, because I've done so much of it, we have such an amazing, massive amount of data. We have millions and millions of data points of how much people get paid. I started consulting and advising other startups on how to set up their hiring process and what are the things they should really think about in order to do things in the candidate's best interest and ultimately to retain the best people at their companies. So today we're going to talk about just that. And if you have questions throughout, feel free to post them in the chat. And I will stop towards the end and tackle the most popular questions in the last 5 minutes. All right, let's go. The very hard reality of startup hiring is that money doesn't solve anything in your company. Many times founders think that as soon as you get funded and as soon as you get that first big round, you can hire out all of your problems. You can hire another engineer, maybe you can hire a designer, a product manager, and it feels like as soon as funding comes in, things will get much easier. And unfortunately, that's actually often not the case. Funding makes things significantly more complex. And throwing people at problems typically is one of the biggest mistakes that will kill your startup. So for instance, maybe you don't have a designer on the team and you need to put something together. Very often founders feel that they need to hire someone for that role immediately. And very often that's actually a mistake. Unless you know how to manage a designer and you also have enough work for this person to really be on your team for years and years and to provide them with career development, you shouldn't be hiring, you should be contracting. And that's a super important distinction. The other thing is hiring is exceptionally time consuming. And very early in your company, you are literally, as a founder, going to be one of the main, if not the main recruiter. And so be prepared for really bifurcating your time between building your company and finding people who will build with you. It's very difficult to find the right type of employee who will thrive in a startup environment. And often startups are fairly chaotic. They take pivots, things change as you learn more about your customers and your market. Pre-PMF, things can be very stressful as well. And it's not an environment everyone can thrive in. So you need to really dedicate a lot of time to figuring out who you want to hire and who is really going to thrive and excel and feel exceptionally happy in the environment that you create. Oftentimes, this means that you might be spending up to 50% of your time in your first year hiring. And hiring is a very, very long process. So in order to get people that will build a multi-billion-dollar company with you, you want to be incredibly selective. Hiring shouldn't be something you're doing shooting off the hip when you have a burning need. So let's talk about that a little bit more in the context of how successful companies do that. So the example I'll give you is from FANG, and FANG stands for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. And how they hire might surprise you, but it also might teach you some best practices that you can adopt at your company. For instance, 80% of hires at these companies come through referral. And so it's really important to get very strong employees very early on in your company, because then they will become recruiters like you and they will bring in other folks from their network who are equally talented. That's how Facebook, Google, Netflix deal with recruiting. Majority comes from referrals. The second thing that they do is called sourcing. We're essentially actively scouting candidates in the market. If you see, or you might have heard your friends talk about how difficult it is to get into these companies, how hard it is to get hired at Facebook. Well, largely because if you submit an application, many times no one's really reading it. The way that Facebook tackles hiring is they have an entire team of recruiters called sourcers, and their sole job is to go out and find candidates that have never applied for a Facebook job. The reality is Facebook wants the very, very best people on the market, and the best people sometimes do not apply. And so the second kind of highest pathway for people to come into FANG is sourcing. And as a founder, you should be doing a lot of this sourcing yourself, basically looking for people in all sorts of places. We'll talk in a moment where good candidates tend to hide, and being able to create relationships with them over a long period of time. The best sourcers at FANG are people who build multi-year relationships, especially for roles that are critical or senior. It's not uncommon that a sourcer would spend 6 months to 2 years courting a candidate and really getting to know them, having casual conversations with them, and not just being goal-oriented to close the hire, but really being oriented towards building a relationship and being really accommodating to the person's needs. So for instance, if someone has a family and they need to move across the country to work with you, make sure that you really discuss what that would look like for them. These are the types of practices that make FANG hiring really, really special. And then the last thing is how the actual interview process happens. And it's incredibly structured. Before you even go into an interview, there's a very robust set of expectations that these companies will send candidates. So it might be something like how many people they're going to speak to, or what the role will pertain, or what is the goal for the position. And throughout all of the interviews, they receive feedback on how they're doing. These are things that don't cost you anything but time to implement. And so that initial time investment could really multiply itself if everyone you bring in then becomes a recruiter like you and brings in top caliber people like you. Companies are not built on great ideas. Companies are built on great talent. And you can't be the most talented person at your company. You essentially need to find everyone who is smarter, better, and faster than you in your space and convince them to find other people like them. And that's essentially what the first, 2 to 5 years of your company will look like until you have your first, 50 to 100 people, and they are all incredibly badass. Now, let's get a little bit more tactical on what that means day to day for you. As a founder, you should absolutely always be in recruiting mode. And there's a very, very big distinction between recruiting and hiring. And often people conflate the two, but they're completely distinct disciplines. It's very, as we mentioned, very hard to find good talent. And you need to build relationships with people over a long period of time. Sometimes that happens directly. You reach out to someone and you grab coffee together and you get to know each other. And maybe you give them the opportunity to visit your company and spend time with the team, get to know everyone else they would be working with. Sometimes that happens through you having a really bright presence on social. So for instance, on LinkedIn or on Twitter, and people get to know you or the way you think or the way you lead your company by reading about your brand and just reading what you post. Both of those methods are fine, but you cannot afford to not do either one of them. One of the biggest mistakes I see in startup hiring is hiring when there's a need versus kind of really planning out the trajectory of who will need to be at your company in 6 months, who will need to be in your company in 1 year, and who are the very best people on the market, and how do you build relationships with them. Realistically, if you approach someone in the very last moment when you need to hire someone in 2 weeks, and if you don't, then your whole project is falling apart. No one is going to make a massive life career decision, especially when it comes to joining a startup, in this very short period. And oftentimes founders get really discouraged. Like, why can't I attract this caliber of talent? Well, it's probably because you're not giving them enough time to make a decision. So typically for senior candidates or for really good engineers, you should dedicate at least 2 to 3 months of time to socialize people, get them familiar with the team before you pull the trigger on hiring them. And oftentimes, going into some of the most common mistakes, oftentimes you actually don't want to hire people right away. For roles that are very critical for your company, you want to start people as a contractor or a consultant to give them an opportunity to get to know you, but also to build expectations both ways of what working together will really look like. Startups are like mini ecosystems, and each one is different than the other. So you can't generalize what working at a startup is like. And someone really needs to experience what your company is like, what your culture is like, how fast you're moving, or how much or how little chaos you have in your shop, to really make a conscious decision of whether that pace is right for them and whether they could be productive in that environment. So one of the most common mistakes I see is people really retaining talent too early. So for instance, if you need to hire a VP of product or your first product manager, and you happen to come across someone who has a great resume, trying to hire them right away is a very, very big mistake. You want to contract with them for at least a couple of months to build mutual expectations. And at the end of the day, that gives both of you better negotiation leverage. It will be really good for the candidate to know what they'll be working on, so they know what fair pay looks like for them, but also what does fair pay look like for you as a founder? How much equity do you actually want to give, or how much base do you actually want to give now that you've seen this person in action and you know what their contribution would look like? It just creates a much better scenario for both of you. The other things that you should be aware of that are very, very common is something I call template hiring. So for instance, I think I need a product manager. I think I need a designer. There's a company that's similar and they have those things, so I should have those things too. Many times companies overhire as soon as they get funded, and overhiring can kill your business because it really slows decision making down. The leaner you are and the longer you remain lean, the higher the likelihood that you'll actually be able to ship something that achieves product market fit. So just because another company has hired for all of these roles, this is not like Pokemon collection cards. You do not need to have like both Pikachu and Baltazar. You need to have the things that you absolutely core every single day can manage as a founder and can dedicate time to. And if you cannot dedicate time to something or roadmap somebody's career or really think through, do I have work for an entire year for this person? You should not hire them. You should contract them. And you should really have a portfolio of really, really good contractors, at least 10 to 12 people in all sorts of disciplines, whether that's growth or whether that's design or product or whatever you might need for the first year before you hire any of these roles. And the last thing that I would mention is if you have worked with people before in your previous job that you really, really like, it does not mean that they will be successful working for you in this new environment now being in a startup. So be incredibly careful because what made them successful in that environment will not necessarily carry over to a startup environment. There's a really great book that I recommend by Boris Groysberg, who is a professor at Harvard. He studies organizational development. It's called Chasing Talent. And it talks about essentially why people, when moving from one Wall Street firm to another Wall Street firm, often cannot achieve the same level of performance. And it's incredibly applicable to how you should think about talent and moving people at a startup. So many times, even someone who's at Facebook, moving to your company may not be successful because of what they were doing at Facebook, maybe not being correlated in pace or complexity to what you're doing at your company. So don't look at just kind of logos and experience, really look at who will be a culture fit for you. Now, let's go through some of the common questions around how you should actually look for this talent and where these people are. It is very tough to find folks, but the kind of 4 things you should think about are, what are communities that are building something that is in your space? For instance, the way that we hire at Candor is very often we will actually peel people out of Indie Hacker because we really want engineers who are entrepreneurial and also have product sense. And so we will look for people from builder communities to recruit them, and that really works for us. But there might be other communities that are specialized to what you're building, where people already are thinking about your problem, are passionate about your problem, and really want to join you. You just have not met them yet. The second place to look is out of market. Right now, it's really, really best time ever to be hiring engineers from places like LATAM or Eastern Europe. And for instance, an engineer from Eastern Europe could be about $3,000 a month for you. And early on in your company, being able to hire someone who is at a more effective pay rate compared to what your run rate is actually a massive advantage. For those of us who are from some of these countries and speak the language, getting a team like that is really very easy, and investors recently have been very open to distributed teams as well. The next place to look at is obviously your network. And again, with the caveat I mentioned before, make sure that people actually will survive the startup environment. Even if it's someone you really like, it's not necessarily someone who will be successful with you. So always be mindful of that. And the last kind of thing, and this is a very powerful hack for founders, is hiring for skills and not for experience. And what I mean by that is many times when we want to hire for instance, roles like growth, it becomes really difficult to think about, how do I find a growth person? They're very expensive. I really need this right now, but I really cannot afford this. How do I swing it? And you kind of almost get in a mindset of, how do I pay a qualified person less to get them in my company, which is a losing proposition for both of you. And so the way you want to think about that is, what are the core skills that I need for the role that I'm hiring for? And how can I find those in someone who maybe not necessarily has the experience yet, but they can get the experience with my company? And I'll give you an example. When we were looking for someone to manage growth, we actually hired someone off of TikTok. It was a person who had 150,000 people following them, that was creating great content. The content was really aligned with what we were doing. And so we knew that this person already understood growth. They just didn't really call themselves a growth person. And it would take very little effort to train them in something like ads, but it takes an enormous amount of effort to train someone how to create viral campaigns, and that person had the skill already. So hire for skills and give people the opportunity of experience in your company. Well, let's go through a couple of tenets of what I call the cardinal rules of what you should absolutely always think about when you hire someone and bring someone in. And I'll go through these fairly quickly so we could wrap up with compensation. So first, you need to be incredibly transparent. The same way that FANG recruits, create as much realistic and transparent expectation throughout the hiring process as you can. Tell candidates from the beginning what your interview process will look like. As much as possible, tell people how much you're planning to pay. Do not play a song and dance of how much are you looking to make. It's your responsibility as a company to have a budget for every hire. And realistically, if you cannot afford to hire this person initially, or if it's towards the end of your budget, then you likely can have them a promotion, or cannot afford to give them a refresher or bonus at the end of the year. And even if you get them in your company, you likely won't keep them. So being transparent kind of puts you in a position where both you and the candidate are working towards a perfect match. Being empathetic is also incredibly undervalued in hiring. So you are not necessarily interest aligned with the candidate, because your interest is to hire someone for your company. Their interest is to be able to feed their family. These are not always interests that are aligned. And so be really understanding of what else this person has going on outside of work. Be really understanding of what accommodations you might need to provide in order to make them comfortable. And also be very realistic about whether you can actually make that commitment. And also, not everyone shines in interviews. Interviews are incredibly stressful, time pressure boxes. And for some people, especially some of the most talented people in our industry who are, neurodiverse, they, are not going to be able to jump through hoops for you. So create an interview process that is inclusive of those people and also puts you in a position where you're not missing out on great talent. And lastly, be accessible. Have as much information available to candidates as you can. Candidates are essentially making an investment decision when they're working with you, because you're paying them in equity, and that equity is part of what they're betting on when they take maybe a lesser salary with you until the company becomes larger. So treat them the way you would treat your investors. Give them the metrics they ask for. Give them opportunity to ask questions about the trajectory and growth of the company. Really bring them on the table and have a very honest conversation about your knowns and your unknowns. And don't ever put people in a position where they feel uncomfortable asking, how do you think we're going to get to Series A? That should be a question you're proactively answering and really selling your candidates on consistently. So now let's talk about compensation in our last couple of moments here. Compensation will make you or break you. And compensation is not a one-time deal. Very much like hiring versus recruiting, paying someone to get into the door is not the last thing or first and last thing you've seen about compensation. Compensation is continuous. And so when you hire a person, you should think about not just how much you're paying them today, but how much you will be giving them at the end of the year if the company is successful. Do you have a bonus program? Do you have any refreshers? How will the person feel if they work for you for several years and they have not gotten any type of raise because maybe the company cannot provide that? And really deeply think about this, because people's job satisfaction really depends on not just the work they're doing and their pay. At the end of the day, we all work to get paid. As crude as that might sound, people, don't work for fun. And if they did work for fun, they probably could not afford their living expenses. So be conscious of the fact that people are very uncertain and insecure when it comes to talking about money, and make it your mission to be as transparent about compensation as possible. This means being able to create progression for every role. So if you bring in somebody as an engineer today, what does that role look like in 2 years or in 3 years? What are they going to learn and what skills are they going to develop? Not just what are they going to do for you. Think about what are you going to do for them. And one of the best ways to think about compensation is in terms of incentive creation. Most startups that are successful are meritocracies. And so instead of paying someone as much as possible when you bring them in the door, think about, how do I create a reward program where the more successful they are, the more we both share in their success. The most successful companies will start at a very low equity pay and then give people refreshers aggressively, sometimes even multiple times a year, until they get to a position where both the candidate and you really feel like you're sharing in what you're building. So it's better to start kind of pay at a base level that you could continue raising someone from. And lastly, not every role should be paid the same. A lot of times founders struggle with pay equity and how do I, maintain fairness in pay. Different roles have a very different impact on your business. So you should not be splitting equity equally. You should not be splitting salary equally. You should really have a system to think about what the person's impact is going to be and what is that value, not just to you, but the value to the business becoming $1 billion business. And that's a conversation you should openly and very comfortably have with any candidate that comes through your door. And you should be able to explain why you're paying someone more and why you're paying someone less. Now, in the current environment, most people right now, there's a very frothy funding environment. And so the trend, at least in US startups, is to pay people more base compensation and much less equity. In fact, base compensation has risen by almost 19% since December this last year, while equity is going down aggressively. And startups are more often than not preferring to sell equity to investors than to give equity to employees. And so that means that you really need to think about your funding trajectory, not just your compensation structure, when you make those decisions. And lastly, before I wrap up here, I wanted to show you some numbers, because anytime I talk about compensation, all everyone wants to know is like, show me the money, like how much should I be paying people? So here you go. These are the averages for the US. In terms of how much people are paying themselves, founders at seed usually pay themselves about $100,000. Founders at stages A to C average about $170,000. When you hire a VP of operations, which typically happens at Series A for most companies, the average tends to be $190K, and the equity will vary depending on how much of the CEO's responsibilities does the VP of Ops actually take over. VP of growth, or first really big growth hire, tends to make 170, and as you will notice, they make a lot less equity than VP of operations, and there are a lot of companies out there that are not paying growth roles any equity, so that's part of why this number is so low. Engineers at seed in the US tend to make 100 to 150K, depending on the type of company. So for instance, in hard tech companies, that number will be higher and actually will sometimes reach the low 200s. And early engineers will almost always make 1%. First engineer you hire can make up to 3%. And then the engineers after that will make either 1, 0.75, or 0.5 until you've reached 5 employees. And then engineers at Series A will usually have a higher salary and a bit lower equity. And then it's actually fairly rare to see product managers hired at seed, because typically the founder is the product manager for the stage. This is the kind of average you will see for pay, and product manager pay in startups is rapidly rising right now. This is one of the hardest roles to hire as a startup currently. And product managers at Series A will make very similar pay to VP of growth. And that's all I've got. I will switch over to the StreamYard tab in case you have any questions or comments. And
hey, Niya, thank you so much. It's great to see hard numbers and actual information like that.
Yeah.
I know everyone's after those real numbers. We have a couple of questions. I have some of my own, obviously, but rather than just jumping onto my end, I want to ask you a couple from the audience.
Sure.
Omer wants to know, in relation to the interview process, what would you recommend for fully remote teams that are growing fast? How does COVID and remote teams change the landscape? And I guess that's a broader question of, I'm seeing much more willingness to hire from afar. How does that screening and introduction and sort of getting to know them process change? And do you find that the sourcers have changed their outreach and where they're looking for talent?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. Yes. So actually, many times people have the misconception that Facebook and Google just hire Harvard and Stanford grads, and that could not be further from the truth. That's actually the last people they would hire. What they tend to do is they tend to look for people out of markets. Right now, most of the hiring is happening out of the country and kind of in the middle of the US, quite frankly. And the way that the compensation and the just kind of recruitment conversations usually work is people will spend several months talking to a candidate to really understand what their working style is. And for startups, they'll usually spend a couple of months also contracting with a remote employee because it's so hard to estimate someone's productivity, what they're actually doing, and also very, very tough to estimate whether or not you will work well asynchronously. Many times there's a time zone component where you're maybe even 10 hours apart if I'm working in San Francisco and someone I'm hiring remotely is working in London. The toughest part of that is that you don't always have the time as a startup to be able to kind of assess people because oftentimes startups hire in an emergency. And so it's really important that you only hire full-time remote when you have had a chance to feel the person out. And unless that's the case, hire them as a contractor and still get them on board, but do not offer them full-time pay until you're fully ready.
I guess as a corollary to that, how do you handle requests for like on spec stuff where someone says, let's code a thing together, or, can you do this work for me? Does that usually chase away the best candidates because they think it's beneath them? Or like, is there a way to do that respectfully that doesn't make them feel like, they're going through their driver's license before getting a new car?
Well, definitely during the interview process, you should focus on selling the candidate on who else is at the company. So who will I be working with? How cool are those people? Why do I want to spend time with them? So that I will jump through any hoop and I will do anything on spec just for the opportunity to be part of this team. And I really understand that I'm just kind of joining a group of people that is, really dedicated to building something I also believe in and I would be really proud to work on. And then when people really believe in the larger mission and in the team, they don't really look at what kind of work you're giving them, especially in the beginning. They almost see it like earning your stripes, that yes, I have to do something to earn these people's trust, and I have to kind of go through that process. And typically that's not an issue. The harder thing is being able to get someone ramped up on your stack very early on when they're remote, because not just working on spec, but being able to kind of get something that you can actually implement. And so you should absolutely have, if you're hiring remote, you should have exceptional documentation for your new hires and not just rely on, folklore, one person saying it to the other.
Yeah, just having the onboarding thing. I know we've grown the team at Embrace by a couple of people this year, and just getting the onboarding package right, even for an organization as small as ours, for context, is huge. Do employees still believe in stock options as a form of compensation? I mean, there's so many different financing vehicles now. It used to be fast agreements, and now you have so many different structures for finance that I've heard rumblings, and some of our attendees asked questions about this, that, people don't really believe in the stock option thing, particularly early on. How savvy are candidates at understanding financial instruments, and how much of an effect do those have now versus, say, 10 years ago?
Sure, I think that's an excellent question. Unless the company has exceptionally strong signaling, so unless you have like Khosla or Founders Fund or Andreessen or Georgian or somebody like that who invested in you, there's a very low chance that the candidate is going to, really believe that the options are worth anything. And so many times what people do is they heavily discount the options. So if you tell them they're worth 100K, unless you have one of those signaling things already in place, they will heavily, heavily discount it. Maybe to them it's worth 20K. Candidates nowadays understand that you need some kind of exit or secondary market in order to cash in on this equity. And so they will usually ask you questions around, so for instance, let's say that you're a B2B SaaS business. How are you actually going to sell this product? Like, who is going to buy it? Is just, all of us are a bunch of engineers. Are you the salesperson as the founder? This doesn't look viable to me. I think, even if the product's amazing, I don't feel comfortable that the equity is worth anything. So we're kind of at that level where every single candidate is treating you like they are investing in you. And many times candidates will actually ask to see your deck and will ask to speak to your investors at seed if you're early. And they will ask metrics questions, and you should absolutely be giving them that information. Have them sign an NDA and treat them as if they're investing money, because they are. They're just investing their time, and time equals money in the end.
That's a really interesting takeaway, is to assume that your early employees, like your titans, your sort of big employees that you're going to bring on, if you have a CTO who's going to join your company and she wants to think of it as like, I'm going to invest the next 5 years of my life in this thing, you're really pitching her as an investor just as much as you would a regular VC firm. But when you say, she wants to join because she gets to work with this other person who's like a legend in this particular software stack or whatever, she might be really excited. But what if you don't have that legendary person on board? Like, how do you get the first one to how do you get that first person to buy in? And obviously there's a chicken and egg problem there. Have you seen anybody do something clever where they, reach out to 3 or 4 candidates and say the 3 of you could work together on this, or like other tactics to sort of skip the inevitable battle between who you might acquire and who's already on the team?
Sure. So recruiting is not it's not a zero-sum game. So if you think that you're going to go out and get someone really amazing to just join you out of the blue, it's not going to happen. So for perspective, even companies like Stripe or DoorDash or Instacart, when they try to hire a senior person from like a Facebook or a Google, literally the founders of those companies will sit down with a deck and a financial projection and will sell the candidate on it over years, not months, not days or weeks, years. And so hiring these very high potential people is an enormous amount of effort. And you should put at least 50% of your time as a founder early on to find the first few, because that is going to make or break your company. What I've seen that's exceptionally successful is people contracting folks, or people asking folks to be advisors or consultants, and really heavily utilizing them. So not just, oh, hey, you're an advisor, let me ask you 5 questions, but really like, here's a meaty part of my business. Can you think about the future together with me? How would you think about this? Like, do you think that we could do this in 10 years? And really get them involved in thinking about your business at your level. And that typically will get people to start thinking about it on their free time, start contributing and helping you on their free time. And ultimately, if it's interesting enough for them, they will almost always proactively ask to get a little bit more involved. But you shouldn't think of it as, how do I go out fishing and catch a shark? It doesn't work that way. You really need to get someone as excited about your problem as you. If you want to retain someone really high caliber. And the other option, something that we do, and it doesn't work for every startup, but it works for us, is we tend to find people very, very early. And we tend to really have people grow with us. So for instance, our founding engineer is 17 years old. And he is absolutely phenomenal. And he is a once-in-a-lifetime talent. And, how many companies will hire a 17-year-old? I don't think that many would, but we hired him. We gave him a level of responsibility that, nobody honestly would at this stage. And he has absolutely blossomed. So your other option is look for talented places where no one else is looking, and figure out which people can you see before anyone else can. And for us, it tends to be people that are young, and actually a significant part of the successful people at our company are not 20 years old yet. But for
Wow.
you, it may be something different.
Amazing. Niya, I wish we had more time to chat, but I know you got people to see in Miami. So thank you so much for sharing this. As I had hoped, I don't think people realize the value of hearing the other side of this. We so often hear from a VC or from a founder, but there's this other side of what are the candidates thinking and how to engineer that kind of serendipity. And I love the idea of don't think about it going fishing. Think about getting someone excited to go on a fishing trip with you. There's much more sort of partnership thing. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Very quickly, how can people find out more about what you do and work with you on this stuff?
Sure. So as a founder, if you need help or advice, I'm almost always happy to hop on a call. You can just find me on LinkedIn. My full name is Niya Dragova. And if you're a candidate, if you decide to look for a new opportunity, you can find Candor at candor.co. Such a pleasure to have everyone today. Thank you so much for the invitation, and really sincerely hopeful this was helpful for all of you. I wish you all the best.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Good to see you again.
Take care.